Well, hello everyone and welcome. My name's Elliot Gu. I'm co-founder of Energy and Income Advisor and the Free Market Speculator. And since it's July 4th weekend, Independence Day weekend here in the United States, I thought I would talk about a topic that's been getting a lot of play in the mainstream media. And that is the competition between the United States and China, and more specifically, the competition between the United States and China over energy policy, and in particular, solar energy. So first up, I have about 7 charts I want to go through today. I'm also going to talk in between these slides as well. But let's start with this slide up first. This is a chart of U.S. and Chinese solar generation in terms of terawatt hours of electricity generation from 2011 up and through 2024. And this slide, like all the slides I'm talking about today, is actually from one of my favorite reports that comes out every year. Now it's actually released by the Energy Institute, and it's called the Statistical Review of World Energy. It comes out towards the end of June usually, just last week here, I believe, this year. And what it is it's just a huge collection of energy-related statistics. Everything from electricity generation for all different countries around the world, as well as sources of energy, just a wealth of information. So all the charts I'm going to talk about today come from there. It used to actually be published by BP, but Energy Institute took it over a couple of years ago, but it's still a treasure trove of information. So I definitely encourage you all to go check it out for yourselves. One of my favorite things to do, though, is not necessarily read the report that they put out with all of the commentary, but actually look at the raw data, because I'm a big believer in going to the data, not looking at summaries, but actually the raw data on energy production, consumption, etc. So this first slide actually shows U.S. and Chinese solar electricity generation from 2011 through 2024. Now the reason I picked these dates, 2011, is that prior to 2011, China generated almost no solar electricity. So the numbers are pretty much meaningless. And obviously there's been very powerful growth in solar generation since that time. 2024, of course, is just the last year for which we have data in that Energy Institute statistical review. So this is a chart that I've seen personally in social media and in the mainstream media. And what it shows is I've got China in blue and the US in orange here. And we're looking at terawatt hours of generation by year from 2011 up through 2024. And you can see that from 2011 up through 2015, there really wasn't much of a difference here. But starting in 2015, 2016, Chinese electricity generation from solar really took off. So over the entire term of this chart, from 2011 to 2024, Chinese solar electricity generation has grown 323 times, not percent, times. Whereas U.S. solar electricity generation has only grown by about 65-fold, 65 times. So both countries have seen very strong growth in solar power generation in terawatt hours, but Chinese growth has been a lot bigger, has been sort of almost 5 times that of the United States. And at the same time, and total generation from solar in China is also today much higher than the U.S., something like 2.6 times higher in China than the U.S. Now let's take a look at the same basic data in a slightly different way. And what we're going to look at on this next slide is actually both countries' share of total global solar generation. So in other words, Chinese solar power generation, as I showed you, is over 800 terawatt hours. The U.S. is around 300, a little over 300. Out of the total amount of solar power generated everywhere in the world, Europe, Latin America, Africa, everywhere in the world, what do these countries have in terms of market share, if you will? And what you can see here is perhaps even more stark. So in 2011, the U.S. actually generated more solar energy than China. That was the case up through 2014, 2015, as I showed you in that prior slide, and then Chinese generation really took off. In terms of global share, China is by far the leader globally in solar electricity generation, with almost a 40% market share. So of all the solar power generated anywhere in the world, China accounts for 40%. The US has actually been pretty flat around this 15% level for some time, and actually its share of global generation, even though it's the second largest producer of solar energy in the world, right, in terms of individual countries, to China being number one, its share of the global market is lower today than it was a few years ago, mainly because China, the other big producer of solar out there, has grown at so much of a faster pace. So these slides, or slides like them, have been getting a lot of attention in the mainstream media lately. The idea being that China is beating the United States in terms of the adoption of solar energy. They're able to manufacture these panels much cheaper, and they're putting up new solar power facilities, new solar power generation facilities at a much faster pace than the United States. So China is beating us on solar. Well, it really isn't quite that simple. The first thing you have to remember is that if you go back through the history of global energy markets, and this is something I did in a book I published called The Silk Road to Riches way back in 2005, but every country in the world, when they go through a stage of development, moving from an emerging market, if you will, to a developed economy, they go through a rapid phase of energy use, energy consumption growth. And not only total energy consumption growth, but energy consumption per capita for every unit of the population. Now, the US, this happened many decades ago, at a time when global energy demand was much lower than it is today, and competition over energy-related resources was actually much lower than it is now. China really, this accelerated phase of energy demand growth, energy consumption growth, only started happening around 20 years ago, around 2005 or 2004 or 2005 or so. And you can see that on this next slide I'm throwing up right now. This is actually total energy supply. This isn't just solar. This is every energy commodity out there. Coal, natural gas, nuclear, electricity, oil burned in cars, everything, right? And you can see that, and I'm measuring it in gigajoules per capita. Now, obviously, the China as a country has a much larger population than the United States, a billion plus. The US is right around 330 million, I believe, right now. So it's a much larger country in terms of population. But US energy consumption on a per capita basis remains far higher than China. So even after this accelerated phase of energy demand or energy consumption growth on a per capita basis since 2004, 2005 or so, Chinese demand for energy in terms of total demand per capita is still much lower than the US. It's about 111.94 gigajoules per capita versus the US at 265.85 gigajoules per capita. So US per capita energy consumption is 2.4 times that of China. So China has a lot of catching up to do, actually, if energy consumption is ever going to get up to US per capita levels. And as the country grows at a rapid pace, as the economy develops, I would expect to see continued growth in per capita energy consumption. Now, if you look at the US line on this slide, which is blue in this case, you can see that per capita energy consumption in the US has actually been falling pretty steadily since the early 2000s. Mainly that's due to simple economics, right? As a country reaches a certain stage of development, oftentimes the engine of the economy shifts from, for example, energy-intensive industries like manufacturing, more in favor of services, which require less energy. In addition, as the cost of energy commodities goes up, say oil or natural gas, for example, companies are always out there looking for ways to use less to produce the same amount or even more. So countries become more energy efficient. So on a per capita basis, the US is a lot more energy efficient than it was 20 years ago. And despite that, China still has a lot of catching up to do to get up to that level of per capita energy consumption. And it may never reach current US levels because the availability of energy commodities out there is lower than it is today than it was, say, 30 or 40 years ago when the US was in a more rapid phase of growth in terms of energy consumption, 50, 60 years ago, really, in this case. So it may never get up there, but certainly the Chinese economy is going to grow on a per capita basis, energy consumption, and you're likely to see Chinese companies continue to find ways to become more energy efficient because, as I said, the availability of energy commodities out there is much lower today than it was back when the U.S. was going through this rapid phase of energy consumption growth, or a country like Japan or South Korea, which went through that rapid phase of growth after the United States. Okay, so let's move on and talk. So, Chinese total energy demand is growing at a faster pace than the U.S. So obviously, you're going to see all forms of generation, whether it be energy generated from solar, or energy generated from coal, or energy generated from nat gas. You're going to see all sources of energy generation, whether it be electricity or other forms of energy, right, is going to grow faster in China than it is in the US because energy demand is growing faster. It's growing on a per capita basis. China has a much larger population than the United States, so that's a multiplier effect. In fact, as I'll show you here in a minute, Chinese energy demand, total energy demand from all different sources, has grown significantly by more than 50 exajoules since 2011. U.S. energy demand is up less than half an exajoule. So I will get into all that here in just a minute. But let's start out by looking at just the electricity portion of China's energy demand, because that's what solar plugs into, right? So let's look at, we've seen tremendous growth in solar energy generation in China, but let's look at the total grid from three main sources I'm going to look at on this next slide. We're going to look at coal, we're going to look at natural gas, and we're going to look at solar. These are three major sources of electricity generation in China. So as you can see here, in terms of terawatt hours of generation, solar, which is that green line, is growing very fast, but it's still nothing compared to the amount of electricity China generates from coal. So coal dominates the Chinese grid. So to make this easier, let's just remove coal from the equation, and let's look at two sources of electricity generation that are often seen as competitors these days. And that is natural gas, which the US is relying increasingly on, and solar, which is a fast-growing source of electricity generation in both China and the United States, though faster growing in China. So here's a chart for China, and you can see that solar energy generation, as I showed you on that prior slide, the first slide actually, is over 800 terawatt hours in 2024, and it's growing, very, very rapidly, both in absolute terms and relative to natural gas. So what you can see here is that in 2011, China generated a lot more electricity using natural gas than it did from solar. Those two lines crossed around 2019, 2020, and then since 2020, there's no competition. Solar has grown much faster than natural gas and has become a much more important source of electricity generation in China than natural gas, okay? China, in fact, generates 2.62 times as much power from solar as natural gas, okay? So again, let's back up for a second. So keep this chart in mind, and let's back up for a second and to the total energy consumption in China, which, as I said, is growing much faster than in the United States. As I said, it's grown by over 50 exajoules. Now, this is total energy supply, right, from all sources: oil, coal, natural gas, solar, wind, etc. And we're going to break down exactly what commodities or what technologies are most important for enabling growth in energy demand in China. But let's just step back for a second and consider that Chinese energy demand since 2011 has grown, and I'll show you that here on this next slide, by 50.8 exajoules, from 108 exajoules in 2011 to 158.88 exajoules in 2024. Now that is actually about 47% growth in exajoule terms. And as I said, this is from all different energy sources. The US has actually seen total energy demand growth between 2011 and today of less than 1/2 of 1 exajoule. Less than 1/2 of 1 exajoule. So Chinese energy demand since 2011 has been 110 times more than the US growth in energy demand. And as I said, a lot of that has to do with phases of economic development. When countries are earlier in their stage of development, when they're still an emerging market, their per capita energy consumption grows very rapidly. When you multiply that by the size of China's population, it creates a lot of growth in raw energy demand. The United States, already developed economy, most companies are looking for ways to conserve on energy, to cut costs, increase their profit margins. That's how capitalism works, right? So US energy demand is slower than Chinese energy demand over time. In other developed markets like Europe, for example, energy demand is actually shrinking because those economies aren't doing as well, growing as fast as the US economy. So even within developed markets, there's a big difference. But comparing a developed market like the US to an emerging market like China, you're always going to see the emerging market show faster growth in energy demand. It has nothing to do with who's doing a better job managing their economy. It's where we are in phases of development. Now, let's take a look specifically at that 50.8 exajoules of total energy demand growth. Now, I showed you a little while ago that electricity generation from solar is growing much faster than natural gas, and it's also a lot larger portion of the Chinese electricity grid than natural gas is at this time in terms of terawatt hours of generation. Over 800 terawatt hours of electricity generation from solar in 2024 versus something like a little over 300 for China. So where is that? So you would expect, wouldn't you, that solar is becoming a very important component of meeting this growing demand for energy overall in China. And in fact, you would think maybe, right, looking at those first slides I showed you and that last slide I showed you, comparing electricity generation from gas versus electricity generation from solar, that solar is a much more important driver of meeting China's growing energy demand than natural gas because it's growing much faster. So surely since 2011, it's become, and it's much bigger in terms of Chinese electricity generation than natural gas. So solar should be more important, right? Wrong. Let me show you this next slide. What this next slide is what I did is I took that 50.8 exajoules of energy demand growth, of total energy supply growth from 2011 to 2024 in China, and I broke it down by technology. So these numbers all add up to about 50.8. And what you're seeing is this is, as I said, this is all energy. This is not just electricity. This is energy for all sources, whether it's gasoline or diesel fuel in a car or a truck, whether it's jet fuel in an aircraft, whether it's natural gas being burned to produce electricity, whether it's solar being used to generate electricity, regardless of end use. This is total energy supply growth from 2011 to 2024 in China, broken down by commodity. And what you can see here is that oil is by far the most important. Of that 50.8 exajoules of energy demand growth, oil is actually accounted for 12.9 exajoules. Coal is number 2 at 12.4 exajoules. Natural gas is number 3 at 10.73 exajoules. And that's that green bar on my chart. Solar is actually one of the least important contributors to Chinese energy demand growth on this entire slide at only about 3.01 exajoules, a little over 3 exajoules. In fact, wind at 3.32 exajoules and nuclear at almost 4 exajoules have been more important to meeting China's growing energy demand than solar. So there are a few points to keep in mind here. One is, And let's just say there are three main points to take away from all these slides I just showed you. One is that those charts that you see out there in the mainstream media showing the rapid growth in Chinese solar energy generation capacity versus in absolute terms, but also versus, say, the United States, they're not telling you the whole story. Yes, Chinese electricity generation from solar is growing at a very rapid pace, but that doesn't necessarily translate into enough energy to meet demand. And it doesn't mean that slower growing technologies like natural gas aren't more important for meeting growing energy demand than solar. Now, one of the main reasons for this is that you can generate a lot of electricity with solar, right? But you can generate a lot of electricity during the day when atmospheric conditions are right. You can't generate electricity anytime you want with solar. Yes, you can hook a battery up to the grid, but battery technology is not to a point right now where it can obviate the need for always available power sources like natural gas or coal. Power plants that can run at near 100% capacity for prolonged periods of time, they can run at night. And battery technology is also far more expensive than, for example, having a natural gas plant located near a solar generating facility to feed power into the grid when solar is not producing enough power to meet demand. So in reality, I'm not saying that solar is useless, but what I am saying is that solar is in some ways a green wrapper for coal, or mainly in the US, for example, natural gas. In other words, when you build more solar capacity, it doesn't mean you get to close down natural gas-fired facilities. You still need natural gas to meet demand for power at times when those solar plants aren't generating anything close to full capacity. Again, yes, you could install energy storage, battery technology. Maybe over time it'll get cheaper. But today, right now, it's much more expensive to use battery technology than to build actually a backup generation facility in the form of gas. So if you look at actual growth in energy demand, solar is far less important than you might think. Another point to keep in mind, difference between the US and China is availability of resources. China does have significant domestic resources, has large oil fields, has large gas supplies, but it's not enough to meet the level of demand growth that they're seeing for energy as their economy rapidly develops, right? So they still have to import a lot of these commodities, whether it be natural gas, whether it be oil. So it's logical for a country that's dependent on imports and believes that access to some of those imported commodities may be troubled for political reasons, right? For example, a dispute between the United States and China could lock China out potentially from US gas supply, or some sort of an issue with Russia could lock China out of Russian gas supply. So it's logical that China would want to develop enough different sources of energy that they're not over-reliant on one single technology. Now, this is one of the major problems Europe has had in recent years. Before the Russia-Ukraine conflict, they became very reliant on natural gas as a source of electricity. And they became particularly reliant. Some European countries had more than 70% reliance on imported gas coming from Russia. The Russia-Ukraine war started, suddenly that supply was in jeopardy, so gas prices soared, and it really has harmed the European economy for ever since. So it's underperformed the United States, certainly economies like China, for years now, mainly because of their lack of access to needed energy for growth, literally. So China doesn't want to make that same mistake that Europe made for years, and so they don't want to have over-reliance on any one source of, any one technology for energy production. So it's logical that they would develop wind, they would develop solar, they would develop nuclear. These are technologies that don't require imports, or don't require as much of an import component as, for example, natural gas or oil. it is logical that you would see a diverse array of different technologies being used out there in China. The U.S. situation is a little different. The U.S. has the largest reserves of gas in the world. It's a growing exporter of natural gas, now the largest exporter and producer of natural gas in the world. It has a lot easier access to, for example, oil. It's less reliant on imports than China is. So it has more flexibility, for example, in growing natural gas generation capacity than China does. So that's also a reason behind the different choices these countries are making in terms of electricity generation. And of course, as I said early on, one major difference being one is a developed market economy, one is an emerging market. You're always going to see faster growth in demand for energy in the emerging market, so China has to make different choices than the United States does. But that brings me back to sort of the main point of this video. If I were a neutral observer, and you hear a lot of China envy out there in the mainstream media, China is growing solar power generation much faster than any other country in the world. Now it accounts for 40% of all solar generation in the world. They're beating us on that technology. They're beating us on growth in clean energy and renewable energy. The reality is, if you actually look at the numbers, the Chinese energy supply is still heavily reliant on coal, oil, right, are the two biggest. But you're also seeing, in terms of growth, those technologies, those fossil fuels, whether it's oil, coal, and natural gas, are still accounting for most of the growth in Chinese energy demand, not solar, not wind. So that's very, very misleading. Also, if I were a neutral energy observer, would I rather have China's energy policy and situation, outlook, or would I rather have the U.S. energy policy and outlook? I think that it's clear that one would rather have the U.S. situation. There will be further growth in U.S. energy demand, for example, electricity, to meet growing demand for AI data centers, right? We're talking about the fastest growth in electricity demand in the United States since going back to the 50s, the 40s and 50s, as basic electrification and electrical appliances in people's homes, people moving from cities to suburbs, bigger houses, all those things were happening. So we are going to see very rapid growth, but the U.S. has a relatively easy solution. Yes, it can grow solar. Yes, it can grow perhaps wind. Yes, it can grow other sources of energy, but we also have vast domestic reserves of natural gas that can be used to back up all those technologies. And we have the cheapest natural gas in the world. If you look at the price of U.S. natural gas versus, say, the cost in Europe or the cost in Asia, it's obviously much lower. So the U.S. has easier access to electricity growth in electricity and generation than does China. So those are just some points to keep in mind. Don't just trust these charts you see sometimes up on social media. They're not the whole story. Solar, yes, you can grow solar energy capacity, solar energy generation very rapidly just by spending a lot of money building plants. But the reality is that because it's not an always available source of energy, it needs to be backed up by conventional fossil fuels, mainly in the form of natural gas or coal, or something like nuclear, which is not a fossil fuel. But you need other sources of power that are always available to back it up. China's growth in solar generation is actually a very tiny component of their overall growth in energy demand. Solar is not the key. If you want to look at the key, it's really oil, coal, and natural gas. So with that, that's the end of the video today. I hope you found that useful or interesting. Hope you can check out all those slides, rewind it, look at all those slides. I've also posted a lot of these slides in the service as well. If you'd like to check out the service in more depth, we do actually have a trial offer, a special trial offer available this month, 4th of July trial offer, if you will. You can click the link below this video and check it out. Thanks for listening. I'll be back with another one of these informational videos in the future. One thing I'm looking at doing, which I've had some questions about, is looking at different U.S. states and their approach to energy supply and what that means for electricity cost, energy costs in those various states. So I may do one of these videos. If you're interested, click the like button below this video or let me know in the comments section and I'll try to put together that video maybe for the next week or two. So thanks again for listening. Want to check out the free trial offer? Click the link below this video. Want to see another video comparing different states within the U.S. approach to electricity supply and pricing? Drop a comment or click the like. Thanks again for listening.